Okay, so you want to own a medieval blacksmith shop. Red iron in the dark, sparks flying into the lane, farmers waiting with broken plowshares, riders holding nervous horses by the reins. A little kingdom of heat and noise where nothing in the village really works until you say it does. Then the better fantasy. You are indispensable. Food moves because your iron holds. Travel happens because your shoes fit. Doors close, carts roll, fields cut, hinges turn, locks bite, all because your hammer lands where everyone else's life meets metal. And then the bigger promise starts to whisper. If everyone needs you, surely everyone pays you, except that what you actually bought was a furnace that eats before you do. Rent, smoke, bellows leather that splits. Iron that has to be paid for before it becomes anything useful. Customers who arrive only when something has already gone wrong and who therefore believe their emergency should become your problem. And indispensability is not the same thing as pricing power. A medieval town could need a smith every day and still haggle over pennies, delay payment, or try to bind the trade inside rules written by masters, landlords, and local custom. So the real question was never whether a blacksmith was useful. Of course he was useful. The question was how a business sitting so close to necessity could still be so easy to ruin. And the whole story turns on whether that anvil is a machine for printing pennies or just a 240 penny paperweight. What you have entered, in other words, is not simply the sword business and not even really the metal business. Most of the time, what you own is a place where breakdown gets turned back into movement. That is a different thing. You are selling resumed motion to carts, resumed traction to horses, resumed cutting to tools, resumed closure to hinges and locks. The common image is a heroic maker of weapons. The more accurate ownership frame is a repair and maintenance bottleneck wrapped around expensive tools and hot fuel. You do not just own skill. You own a choke point where delay is costly. Let's open one and find out. A good anchor for this is London, because by 1299, the blacksmiths of the city were already visible enough to be mentioned as a recognized company. That matters. It tells you this was not some loose, romantic lone craft drifting outside the market. It was organized, watched, and already important enough to leave an institutional footprint. And the revealing part is how modest that beginning looks when set against the later prestige of a London livery company. It starts not with empire, not with an industrial district, not with an enormous treasury, but with a trade solid enough to need regulation and collective standing. That is medieval business in miniature. A craft begins as a narrow practical necessity, then thickens into rules, status, gatekeeping, and eventually civic power. So if you imagine yourself opening a smithy in late medieval England, the through line is not a glamorous workshop full of noble commissions. It is a craft that became important precisely because ordinary life kept breaking at iron points every day, in public, and somebody had to monetize the fix. The first shock is the entry cost. Late medieval English price evidence gives us a blacksmith's anvil at 1, which is 240 pence, and the bellows at another 30 shillings, or 360 pence. A cheap hammer cost 8 pence. Even before you start talking about tongs, chisels, stock iron, charcoal, shelter, and a working hearth, your core setup is already 608 pence. Since a laborer could expect about £2 a year, roughly 480 pence, or around 2 pence a day, the anvil and bellows alone represented more than a full laborer's annual income. Add even a modest rented place. A cottage could run about 60 pence a year in the 14th century. A craftsman's house around 240 pence. So your stripped down start is something like 668 pence with the cheaper roof, or 848 pence with the more substantial one. That is about 334 to 424 laborer days at the 2 pence benchmark. Call it roughly a year and a half to nearly 2 years of an ordinary worker's earning just to get a real forge standing. And this is where the contract determines everything. If you own tools but rent the frontage, your risk is fixed before the first customer appears. If you are inside a town craft structure, masters can regulate apprentices and the materials allowed, which means scaling your labor force is not simply a matter of demand. If you work under a landlord's property or a manor's expectations, then some of the upside leaks away before it reaches your hand. Medieval ownership was rarely clean. One man might own the anvil, another the building, a third the local standing to train boys into workers. And the market itself could be narrowed by guild practice. A blacksmith shop was not just a pile of iron. It was a legal position. There were also real tiers to this business. At the bottom was the lean setup, a small rented place, family labor, a narrow local radius, mostly repairs and essential farm or household work. Above that sat the town smith with better frontage, steadier horse traffic, more chance of repeat customers, and possibly an apprentice or hired hand. Then there was the more ambitious master position inside an organized urban craft, where the shop was not just a forge but a training point, a commercial address, and eventually a civic foothold. The key detail is that each tier changed the business model more than the product. The smallest operator lived by flexibility. The middle one lived by volume and reliability. The upper one started to live by control over labor and access. Operating costs were where the fantasy really came apart. Labor first. After the Black Death, Labor scarcity drove wages upward so sharply that Parliament stepped in during 1351 to force wages back toward older levels. The benchmark table is revealing even if it is not blacksmith specific. Haymaking capped at 1 penny a day, reaping at 2, coopers at 3, carpenters at 4, masons at 4. What that tells you is not exactly what your assistant smith cost, but the wage gravity around skilled hands. If your shop relied on hired labor, you were competing against a wider market for capable men whose outside options had improved. That means the safest smithy was often the one resting on family labor or very carefully limited hired help, because a full-time wage commitment could turn a useful shop into a hungry one. Then the major input. Iron matters, obviously, but what kills you operationally is that iron never arrives alone. Iron implies transport, working time, waste, and fuel. The metal is only the visible cost. The invisible cost is every extra heating, every ruined piece, every hour the bellows are feeding fire before an item is billable. That is why input volatility hits several lines at once. If your stock becomes dearer, the part you hammer costs more, the time you spend reshaping it matters more, and your customer becomes more price sensitive right when your own margin is tightening. The shop did not just consume iron, it consumed timing. So the revenue stack had to be built in layers. The floor was repetitive necessity, mending what was already in service. This is the boring work, which is exactly why it mattered. A business tied to boring repeat failure is often sturdier than one tied to glorious occasional demand. Above that came the smoother layer. Work that kept transport and agriculture moving, the kind customers could postpone for a few days but not forever. Then came the multiplier. Custom work with some room for margin because it required judgment, not just labor. Not the fantasy of endless swords, but the quieter advantage of being the person who knew what shape, thickness, fit, or reinforcement would keep a tool, fitting, or working edge alive longer. And above even that sat the wild card, which was urgency. Medieval customers did not love paying more. They paid more when delay cost them more than your fee. That is the economics most people miss. A smith was not merely selling iron transformed by hammer blows. He was selling the cost of not waiting. Which customer was worth more? The man buying a flashy piece once, or the man whose cart, fieldwork, or horse had stopped today? Usually the second. The glamorous item draws the imagination. The stalled workflow pays the rent. In practice, the hidden earner was often not the most dramatic object in the shop. It was the steady stream of ordinary breakdowns that had to be reversed quickly. Take one transaction from start to finish. A ploughshare comes in worn and no longer biting cleanly. The customer does not want philosophy. He wants his field moving again. First, the smith inspects whether this is a simple reforging job or whether fresh iron must be added. That decision is if it can be drawn back into shape from the old metal, the customer is mostly buying skilled time, fuel, and queue priority. If new iron is needed, material cost enters immediately. Next comes hearth time. The forge is heated, the bellows worked, the piece brought to the right temperature, then hammered, corrected, possibly reheated, and finished. If an apprentice helps, that is cheaper labor feeding the process, but the master's eye still controls the billable judgment. Then comes settlement, and medieval settlement is rarely as clean as a modern till receipt. Some customers pay cash, some pay later. Some are good for it because everyone knows where they live, which means the transaction is not complete when the ploughshare leaves hot. It is complete when labor, fuel, material, and credit risk have all been priced without scaring away the next customer in line. That is why the core insight is brutally simple. The winning blacksmith was not the man who made the most impressive iron, but the one who kept fixed commitments lower than recurring necessity. In plain terms, he kept rent manageable, labor flexible, and expensive stock turning. The shop looked like a production business. Economically, it was a commitment management business. Once you see that, the whole trade changes shape. The forge is important. The contract is more important. The hammer matters. The queue matters more. The first big mistake was to confuse indispensability with freedom. After the Black Death, labor became scarce enough that the crown tried to push wages back down by statute in 1351. That tells you the labor market had become unstable, contested, and political. If you expanded your shop on the assumption that necessity guaranteed easy margins, you could get trapped between rising labor expectations and customers who still bargained like yesterday's world existed. The second mistake was to confuse prestige with turnover. Guild structures existed to regulate apprentices and preserved the trade's standing, which protected quality and status, but they also meant expansion was not frictionless. If you loaded yourself with too much fixed shop cost, too much ambitious work, or too much money sleeping in stock, you could look respectable and still starve. A medieval smithy usually died not because iron ceased to matter, but because commitments hardened faster than cash came in. So what did a good year and a bad year actually look like? We have to be honest here. For one ordinary late medieval English smithy, the full annual books do not not survive in the material we are using, so the figures are a reconstruction built from the wage and price benchmarks we do have. In a good year, a middling town smith with reliable repeat work might gross something like 600 to 7 pounds, or 1,440 to 1,680. That sounds strong until you convert it. Gross revenue there equals only about 3 to 3.5 laborer years. Out of that come rent, fuel, replacement stock, tool wear, and some paid help. If your premises are more like a craftsman's house at 240 pence a year, and you spend several hundred pence across iron, fuel, and intermittent labor, a good year may leave you with something near a laborer's annual income in true surplus, not riches. Respectable, viable, fragile. Now the bad year. Suppose demand softens, or customers stretch payment, or input costs bite harder than expected, or you kept help on the payroll too long. Gross receipts slide toward 4 ounces or so, around 960 pence. That is still twice a laborer's annual wage in appearance, which sounds decent until the fixed parts do not shrink with the income. Rent is still rent. The forge still eats. Stock already bought still has to be turned into something saleable. Suddenly, the shop that looked central to everybody's life is producing almost nothing once commitments are paid. A good year buys stability. A bad year reveals the business model. And the model says the difference between comfort and strain can be narrower than one anvil. Who actually won then? Often not the man who remained only a smith. The more durable winners used the shop as a base camp for status, network, and office. The broader medieval pattern matters here. In places like Dinklespool, smiths were important enough to gain the right to stand on the town council by 1387. That does not mean every blacksmith became a civic notable. It means the trade's real escalator was not simply better ironwork. It was institutional conversion. If you could turn reliability into reputation, reputation into local trust, and trust into office, contracts, or advantageous marriages, then the shop stopped being your ceiling and became your platform. The richest outcome was usually not endless hammering. It was escaping dependence on hammering alone. So the medieval blacksmith shop was never the fantasy of a man standing over fire while coins fell from the chimney. You were never really buying iron or sparks or even skill by itself. You were buying a claim on interruption, a right to stand exactly where horses slipped, tools dulled, carts failed, and work stopped, and to charge for restarting the world one repair at a time. If you managed rent, labor, and stock better than your rivals, that anvil could indeed print pennies. If you did not, it stayed what it had always been, a 240 penny paperweight. The governing truth of the business was simple. A medieval smithy made money only when necessity stayed repetitive and the owner stayed disciplined.